The practice field was empty except for the two of them. Everyone else had gone in. The afternoon had turned cold in the way Cleveland afternoons turned cold in late autumn, not gradually, not with warning, but with the abrupt finality of a city that had stopped pretending summer was still a possibility. The other players had felt it and gone inside to the warmth of the locker room and the particular relief of a practice that was finished. Jim Brown had not gone inside. He was still on the field, running routes that no one had asked him to run, carrying a ball that no one had handed him, working through something in his body that the structured practice had not resolved. The coach watched him from the sideline with the particular stillness of a man who is deciding whether to speak and has not yet made the decision. The coach's name was Blanton Collier. He had taken over the Cleveland Browns in 1963, inheriting a team that had talent and frustration in roughly equal measure, and a running back who was, by that point, already widely understood to be the best at his position in the history of the game. He was a thoughtful man, a careful man, a man who had spent his career thinking about football the way serious people think about complex problems from multiple angles simultaneously, with respect for what he did not yet know and attention to what the evidence was actually telling him. He understood Jim Brown. Not completely, no one understood Jim Brown completely, and the people who believed they did were the people Jim Brown had the least use for. But Collier understood enough. He understood that the man currently running routes alone on a cold practice field in late November was not doing it because he needed the repetitions. He was doing it because something was unresolved, and the resolution required movement, and the movement required space, and the space was here. He walked onto the field. What happened in the next 20 minutes? What was said between those two men on that cold afternoon, with no other players present, and no reporters, and no cameras, is not recorded in any official account. The people who knew both men well, and who understood the particular dynamic that existed between them, have offered fragments over the years. Enough fragments to understand the shape of the conversation, if not every word of it. But to understand why that conversation mattered, why what happened on that practice field the day before the most important game of the season changed something between a coach and his player that would carry through to the championship, you have to understand what each of those men was carrying when they walked onto the field that afternoon. Blanton Collier had taken over a team in transition. The Cleveland Browns of the early 1960s were a team with unfinished business, talented, capable of greatness, and operating under the specific frustration of a group that understood it was better than its recent results had demonstrated. The 1963 season had been promising. The 1964 season had the quality of something that could be completed, that could arrive at the destination the talent pointed toward, if the pieces held together and the decisions were right and the man carrying the ball stayed healthy and willing. The man carrying the ball had never had a problem staying healthy. The question of willingness was more complicated. Jim Brown was not a difficult player in the ordinary sense. He was not a locker room problem. He did not create drama or undermine teammates or arrive late or leave early or do any of the things that coaches use as evidence when they need to build a case against a player whose talent makes him otherwise untouchable. He worked. He prepared. He showed up and he performed, and the performance was at a level that made complaints about anything else difficult to sustain. But he was not a player who accepted instruction without examination. He was not a player who ran a play because the play was called without first understanding, to his own satisfaction, why the play was called and whether the reason was sufficient. He had opinions about the offense. He had opinions about how he should be used, what the defense was giving, where the opportunity existed that the game plan might not be fully addressing. These opinions were not always wrong. In fact, they were right with a frequency that made them impossible to simply dismiss, which created its own kind of problem for the coaches who had to decide what to do with a player whose football intelligence matched his physical gifts. Collier's approach to this was different from his predecessors. Where Paul Brown had responded to Jim Brown's opinions with the particular rigidity of a man who understood the chain of command as non-negotiable and found challenges to it threatening. Collier was more interested in what the opinions were actually worth. He had watched Jim Brown long enough to understand that the opinions usually had something in them, that the running back who led the league in rushing 8 times out of 9 was not operating on instinct alone, but on a genuine understanding of the game that deserved to be taken seriously. This did not mean that Collier simply deferred to Jim Brown's judgment. It meant that the conversation between them was a real conversation, one in which the coach's authority was genuine and the player's intelligence was respected, and the outcome was sometimes different from what either of them had planned when the conversation started. On the afternoon before the most important game of the season, the conversation that needed to happen had not yet happened. Jim Brown had been carrying something into practice for 3 days. The people who knew him well enough to read the signs, the particular quality of his silence, the way his attention moved through a room without landing on anything, the extra time he spent on the field after the scheduled work was done, those people had noticed. They had noticed and said nothing, because they understood that the thing being carried was not something that responded well to being named before it was ready to be named. The game plan for the following afternoon was correct. Technically, professionally, carefully correct. Collier had spent the week studying the opposing defense with the focused attention of a man who took preparation seriously, and the plan he had arrived at addressed the defense's strengths and targeted its vulnerabilities with the precision that careful film study made possible. It was a good plan. Jim Brown had looked at the plan and seen something that the plan had not seen. Not a flaw, exactly. Something more like an absence, a possibility that the plan had not accounted for, a seam in the defense that the film had shown him, but that the plan had not addressed. He had been carrying this observation for 3 days, turning it over, examining it from different angles, deciding whether it was real or whether it was the kind of thing that looks real on film and disappears on the field. He had decided it was real. And he had decided, on the afternoon before the game, that the decision about whether to say so required more than a film room conversation or a brief exchange on the practice field with other players present. It required the kind of directness that the circumstances demanded and that Jim Brown was constitutionally incapable of avoiding when directness was what the situation called for. He dropped the ball and turned and looked at Collier standing at the edge of the practice field. The conversation began with the play. Jim Brown described what he had seen in the film, the specific alignment the defense used in second and long situations, the gap that opened between the linebacker's responsibility and the safety's responsibility when the linebacker was pulled toward the flat, the window that existed for approximately 3 seconds on any given play before the pursuit angles closed it. He described it the way a man describes something he has looked at carefully and understands with precision, not urgently, not as a demand, but as an observation being offered to someone who might find it useful. Collier listened. He had watched the same film. He had arrived at a different conclusion about that alignment, or rather, as he understood listening to Jim Brown, he had not fully followed the conclusion to where Jim Brown had followed it. He had seen the alignment and noted it. He had not traced what it produced 3 plays later when the defense adjusted. This was not a comfortable thing to acknowledge. Coaches who have spent a week preparing a game plan do not enjoy discovering 24 hours before the game that there is something the game plan has not accounted for. The discovery is useful. The comfort of it is something else entirely. But what happened next was not what happened in most coach-player conversations about game plans the day before a game. Collier did not dismiss the observation. He did not explain why the existing plan was sufficient and the alternative was unnecessary. He asked a question. He asked Jim Brown, if we build the game around this, if we commit to attacking that seam early and forcing the defense to respond to it, what happens to everything else we've planned? Jim Brown thought about this for a moment. The cold was getting into the field now, the kind of cold that settled into the grass and stayed there. He thought about it with the seriousness of a man who had been asked a real question and understood that the answer needed to be real. He said, "Everything else gets easier." The conversation that followed lasted the better part of 20 minutes. It was not a comfortable 20 minutes. It was the kind of conversation that happens when two people are trying to solve a genuine problem and neither of them has the complete answer, and both of them understand that the incomplete answers they each carry need to find a way to become something more complete before the next afternoon. Collier pushed back, not because he disagreed, but because the questions Jim Brown's observation raised needed to be examined before the answer could be trusted. What happened if the defense adjusted faster than expected? What happened if the window closed before the play developed? What happened to the players who had been preparing for the existing game plan if that plan changed significantly in the final 24 hours? Jim Brown had answers to some of these questions and not to others. The ones he didn't have answers to, he said so. He was not trying to win the conversation. He was trying to get the game right. And getting the game right required the questions to be asked, even when he didn't have the answers. This was the thing about Jim Brown that Blanton Collier understood and valued, and that most of the sports world, focused on the yards and the power and the unstoppable physical force, had not fully processed. The running back who led the league in rushing was not operating from instinct. He was operating from intelligence, a deep, applied, constantly examined understanding of the game that he had been developing since he first played it, that he tested against evidence and revised when the evidence required revision and held to when the evidence supported holding. He was not always right. He was right often enough that being wrong did not undermine the framework. And he was honest enough about the difference that the people who listened to him carefully learned, over time, to trust the distinction. Collier made a decision. He told Jim Brown that the game plan would be adjusted, not rebuilt. There was not time to rebuild, and the existing plan had enough right in it that rebuilding would discard things worth keeping. But adjusted. The seam Jim Brown had identified would be built into the early series. The offense would go there first, force the defense to show its response, and the response would determine what came next. Jim Brown nodded. He picked up the ball he had dropped. He ran one more route, a single route, sharp and clean, the kind of route that a man runs when he is confirming something to himself rather than practicing, and then he went inside. The game the following afternoon was played in front of a Cleveland crowd that understood, without being told, that something significant was at stake. Not just the game, not just the season. The particular possibility of completion that had been building through the weeks and months of a season that had gone mostly right and needed one more afternoon of going right to arrive at the place it was pointing toward. The first series of the game, Jim Brown took a handoff on 2nd and 8 and hit the seam that he had described on the cold practice field the previous afternoon. The linebacker moved toward the flat. The safety had not yet adjusted. The window was there, exactly where it had been on the film, exactly as Jim Brown had said it would be. He gained 11 yards. On the sideline, Blanton Collier made a note on his play sheet. Not a large note, the kind of mark a man makes when something he was told would happen has happened, and he is recording the confirmation. The defense adjusted as it always adjusted, as defenses against Jim Brown always adjusted with the desperate pragmatism of a group of men who understood that what was working was going to keep working unless they did something different. They shifted the linebacker's responsibility. They brought the safety up 2 yards. They created a different alignment that closed the seam Jim Brown had attacked. And in doing so, they opened something else. Jim Brown spent the rest of the first half attacking the something else, not because the game plan had specified it, because the defense's adjustment had created it, and he could see it, and the conversation on the practice field had established, between him and his coach, a shared understanding that what Jim Brown could see on the field, in real time, was worth acting on. By halftime, Cleveland had the lead. Not a commanding lead. The game was close in the way that important games are close, with both teams capable of changing the outcome, and neither team willing to give the other the space to do it easily. But a lead. In the locker room, Collier said very little. The adjustments that needed to be made were small. The players who needed specific information received it. Jim Brown sat in the corner of the locker room with a towel over his shoulders and said nothing at all, which was what he did when the game was going the way he understood it was going to go, and the halftime was something to get through on the way back to the field. The second half was Jim Brown's. Not in the sense of a single transcendent performance, not the kind of afternoon that produces the statistics that end up in record books and highlight reels decades later, but in the deeper sense of a player who had understood something about the game before it was played and was now, in the playing of it, demonstrating the understanding in real time, against real resistance, in front of 80,000 people who were watching but not seeing all of what was actually happening. He carried the ball 23 times in the second half. Not all of them went for significant yardage. Some of them were stopped for short gains. A few went nowhere. This is what football looks like when it is being played seriously, not a series of long runs and broken tackles and highlight moments, but the grinding, incremental work of moving a ball forward against people who are specifically employed to prevent it, using the information that each play provides about what the next play can do. Jim Brown used the information. Every carry told him something about the defense's response, about where the next seam would open, about what the linebacker was thinking and what the safety was committing to, and where the gap between those two things existed. He carried this information from play to play, the way a chess player carries the state of the board, not as isolated facts, but as a developing picture of what was available and what was about to become available. The defenders who faced him that afternoon were good players, professionally prepared, physically capable, doing their jobs with the focus that important games produce. They tackled him. They brought him down. They held him to short gains on plays where the design had given him more. They did everything correctly, and they still could not prevent the accumulation, the slow, steady, relentless forward movement of a man who understood more completely than they did what the defense was going to do before it did it. Cleveland won. The margin was not large. The game had been close enough that a different play on a different series might have produced a different result, and the people on the losing side could point to moments where the outcome had balanced on something small. This is true of most games. It is the nature of football that the difference between winning and losing is usually smaller than the final score suggests. What was not small was what Jim Brown had done the previous afternoon on a cold practice field, alone with a coach who was willing to listen. What was not small was the 20 minutes of conversation that had produced a game plan adjustment, that had produced an 11-yard gain on 2nd and 8, that had produced a defensive response, that had produced everything that came after. Blanton Collier coached the Cleveland Browns through the 1970 season. In his 7 years as head coach, the team went to the playoffs 4 times and won the NFL championship in 1964. He was, by any measure, one of the more successful coaches of his era. He spoke about Jim Brown in interviews with the careful precision of a man who had thought deeply about something and wanted to describe it accurately. He said that coaching Jim Brown required a particular kind of honesty, not the honesty of a coach telling a player what needed to improve, but the honesty of a coach willing to be told what he had missed. He said it was not always comfortable. He said it was always useful. He said the practice field conversation the afternoon before the game was the moment he understood, completely and finally, what he was working with. Not the physical gifts, those had been visible from the first day, the football intelligence. The willingness to be right about something and to say so directly, and then to listen to the questions about whether the rightness held up under examination, and to revise when the examination found something the original assessment had not accounted for. He said, "Most players will tell you what they see. Jim Brown would tell you what he saw, and then ask you what it meant." Jim Brown played 3 more seasons after that game. He retired in 1966 at 30, while still the best player in the league. He never said that the conversation with Collier was the reason. He never spoke about what happened on the practice field as a turning point, or a revelation, or any of the things that stories about important moments tend to become. But the people who were close to him in those years, who watched him play through 1,964 and 1,965 with the particular quality of a man who had found in the relationship with his coach something that the previous arrangement had not provided, said that something changed after that autumn, that he played with a different kind of freedom. Not physically, the physical gifts had always been freely expressed, but strategically, as if the game had opened up in a direction that had previously been partially closed. As if the conversation on the cold practice field had confirmed something he had always understood about himself, but had not always had the space to use. The 20 minutes, the cold field, the coach who walked out and asked a real question and listened to the answer and made the adjustment. These are not the things that end up in the record books. The record books hold the yards and the championships and the Pro Bowl selections and the rushing titles. They do not hold the conversations that made those things possible, the moments between the performances where the understanding was built that allowed the performances to be what they were. Jim Brown understood this. He understood that the yards were visible and the intelligence behind the yards was not, and that the invisibility of the intelligence was partly what allowed it to work. You cannot defend against what you cannot see. You cannot prepare for a player whose advantage is not physical, but cognitive, whose edge is not in the speed or the power, but in the understanding, the complete, examined, constantly refined understanding of what the game was doing and what it was about to do. The defense could stop a fast back. The defense could scheme against a powerful back. The defense could not stop a back who already knew, when he took the handoff, which defender was going to be in the wrong position and why, and had already decided where to put the ball before the gap had fully opened. That was Jim Brown. That was always Jim Brown. The yards were just what happened when you put that understanding into a body that could execute it at the highest level the game had ever seen. Everything else was the work that the record books don't hold.